In the depths of a Canadian cold snap, a message crossed the Atlantic. The only son of Princess Alexandra, Duchess of Fife, had died at the age of 28. The official story was a tragic accident, a drunken night that ended in hypothermia next to an open window. But for his mother, that explanation was too tidy, too simple to cover a loss so great and questions that would never be answered. Behind the dignified silence of the royal family, whispers of a darker truth began to spread, a mystery that would haunt the princess for the rest of her life. She, her younger sister Maud, and their now widowed mother, the shy and retiring Princess Royal, formed a quiet, self-contained female household that stood slightly apart from the bustling heart of the court of their uncle King George V. Their period of deep mourning removed them from the social whirl, allowing Alexandra the time to begin the steep learning curve of her new role. She spent more and more time in Scotland, poring over ledgers with estate managers, learning the intricacies of agricultural tenancies, salmon fishing rights, and forestry. It was a man's world, and she had to navigate it with a quiet determination that belied her youth and her gentle demeanor. This practical education, so different from the deportment and drawing lessons of her youth, solidified the serious, capable side of her nature. It grounded her, giving her a sense of purpose rooted not in the ephemeral world of London society, but in the ancient, enduring landscape of her paternal homeland. These 2 years, from the beginning of 1912 to the summer of 1914, were a strange, dreamlike interlude. It was the last breath of the old world, a final feverish waltz on the edge of a precipice. For a young woman of Alexandra's rank, life was a carefully choreographed sequence of social events, albeit one tempered by her family's recent mourning. There would have been quiet dinners, family gatherings at Sandringham and Balmoral, and the ever-present unspoken question of marriage. As a duchess in her own right, a princess of the United Kingdom, and a great heiress, she was arguably the most eligible woman in the country. Suitors, both British and foreign, would have been considered, but Alexandra's unique position and reserved character called for a very particular kind of man. He appeared in the form of Prince Arthur of Connaught. Arthur was, in many ways, the perfect dynastic and personal match. He was her first cousin once removed, a grandson of Queen Victoria through her third son, Prince Arthur, Duke of Connaught. This placed him firmly within the inner circle of the family. More importantly, he was a man of impeccable character. A career soldier with the 2nd Dragoons, Royal Scots Greys, he was a respected officer who had served in the Second Boer War. Unlike his cousin, the famously restless and pleasure-seeking Prince of Wales, the future Edward VIII, Arthur was the embodiment of duty, stability, and quiet competence. He was handsome in a solid, dependable way, and his reserved, thoughtful nature was a perfect complement to Alexandra's own. He understood the demands of royal life, yet as a grandson of the monarch in the male line, he carried a higher royal rank than she did, His Royal Highness, which neatly solved any questions of precedence. Their courtship was not a whirlwind, headline-grabbing romance. It was a slow, gentle, and private affair, evolving naturally out of their shared social circles and mutual family approval. The attraction was based not on passionate fire, but on a deep and genuine personal compatibility. In Arthur, Alexandra found a kindred spirit, a man who understood the weight of history and lineage, but was not defined by it, a man who valued duty and service above personal gratification. For Arthur, Alexandra was not just a great catch. She was a gentle, kind, and intelligent woman with a strength of character he deeply admired. Theirs was a union that promised stability and quiet companionship in a world that was growing increasingly unstable. Their engagement was formally announced in the summer of 1913, and it was met with universal approval. King George V, who had a deep affection for his 5 nieces, readily gave his formal consent, as required by the Royal Marriages Act of 1772. The king understood that the days of using his relatives as pawns in European diplomacy were over. The world had changed. The important thing now was the stability of the monarchy at home, and a happy, stable marriage for his niece to a respected British prince was a far better outcome than some miserable, politically motivated foreign alliance. On the 15th of October, 1913, Princess Alexandra, Duchess of Fife, and Prince Arthur of Connaught were married. The ceremony took place in the intimate, historic setting of the Chapel Royal at St. James's Palace, the traditional venue for more private royal weddings. Yet the guest list was a dazzling roll call of the old European order. The king and queen were there, along with Alexandra's grandmother, the beloved Queen Alexandra, and a host of cousins, uncles, and aunts who represented the royal houses of Spain, Denmark, and Norway. It was a sea of tiaras, military uniforms, and priceless family jewels, a magnificent display of dynastic unity. As Alexandra walked down the aisle, now to be styled Her Royal Highness Princess Arthur of Connaught, Duchess of Fife, she seemed to have fulfilled her destiny perfectly. She had secured a stable, respectable marriage that cemented her place at the very heart of the senior royal circle. She had a loving husband, a clear path of public duty ahead of her, and the security of her own great title and fortune. For a brief, shining moment, her future seemed utterly, unimpeachably secure. Yet this glittering ceremony was, in retrospect, a ghost at a feast. It was the last great royal wedding of the old world. As the royals celebrated in London, the armies of Europe were sharpening their bayonets. The Balkan Wars had just concluded, leaving a legacy of bitterness and instability in southeastern Europe. In Ireland, the crisis over home rule was pushing the nation to the brink of civil war. The intricate dance of alliances that had divided the continent into 2 armed camps, the Triple Entente of Britain, France, and Russia, and the Triple Alliance of Germany, Austria, Hungary, and Italy, grew ever more rigid and unforgiving. The glorious sunlit afternoon of Alexandra's wedding was in reality the deep twilight of an era. The darkness was about to fall. The spark, when it came, was in a city most Britons could barely place on a map. On the 28th of June, 1914, in Sarajevo, a Serbian nationalist assassinated Archduke Franz Ferdinand, the heir to the Austro-Hungarian throne. At first it seemed like just another distant Balkan crisis, but the dominoes had been set up long ago. An Austrian ultimatum to Serbia, a Russian mobilization to protect its Slavic brethren, a German declaration of war on Russia, and then France. Suddenly, the unthinkable was happening. Germany's war plan, the Schlieffen Plan, required a swift invasion of France through neutral Belgium. Britain, honoring a treaty to protect Belgian neutrality that many had considered a mere formality, issued an ultimatum to Germany. It was ignored. On the 4th of August, 1914, Great Britain declared war on Germany. The long Edwardian summer had come to a violent, shuddering, and bloody end. The initial reaction in Britain was not one of fear, but of a kind of euphoric, patriotic fervor. Crowds gathered outside Buckingham Palace singing, "God Save the King." Young men rushed to enlist, convinced the war would be a grand adventure, a short, sharp conflict that would be, in the famous phrase, over by Christmas. For the royal family, however, the war was a profound and deeply personal catastrophe. This was not a war against a faceless, distant enemy. This was, in many ways, a family feud that had escalated into global slaughter. King George V's first cousin was Kaiser Wilhelm II of Germany, Willie, as he was known in the family. His other first cousin was Tsarina Alexandra of Russia, married to Tsar Nicholas II. The King of Norway was his brother-in-law. The Queen of Spain was his cousin. The intricate network of blood that had been the pride of Queen Victoria had now become a source of immense tragedy and acute political embarrassment. The uncle of Europe was gone, and his descendants were now leading their nations into the greatest and most brutal conflict in human history. As the horrifying reality of modern industrialized warfare became clear, the machine guns, the heavy artillery, the poison gas, the trenches, life in Britain transformed. The initial jingoism gave way to a grim determination. The lists of the dead and wounded grew ever longer, stretching from the grandest stately homes to the humblest terraced houses. The role of the monarchy itself had to adapt. King George V and Queen Mary understood that in this time of national crisis, they had to be seen as the unambiguous heart of the British nation. They worked tirelessly, visiting troops, inspecting factories, and bestowing medals on wounded soldiers. They embodied the spirit of national sacrifice, even instituting rationing at Buckingham Palace. This new climate of austerity and duty swept through the entire aristocracy. The great London houses were turned into hospitals and convalescent homes. Women of the upper classes, Alexandra included, swapped their glittering ball gowns and feathered hats for the stark white uniform of a nurse. This was not a token gesture. Driven by the same profound sense of duty that defined her character, Alexandra enrolled in a nursing course at St. Mary's Hospital, Paddington. She trained alongside ordinary women and fully qualified as a state-registered nurse. She worked long, grueling hours on the wards, tending to the endless streams of horrifically wounded men returning from the trenches of Flanders and the Somme. This was a world away from the manicured lawns of Mar Lodge and the gilded corridors of St. James's Palace. Here, the horrors of the war were immediate and visceral. The stench of gangrene, the screams of men in agony, the quiet, exhausted despair of the permanently maimed. She was no longer Her Royal Highness Princess Arthur of Connaught, Duchess of Fife. She was Nurse Connaught, cleaning wounds, changing dressings, and comforting dying men. The experience must have been transformative, stripping away the last vestiges of her sheltered youth. The rigid class barriers that had defined her entire life began to dissolve in the face of shared national trauma. She saw suffering and death on a scale she could never have imagined, and it forged in her a quiet resilience and a profound empathy that would remain with her for the rest of her life. She did not stop there. She continued formal training, qualified as a state-registered nurse in 1919, and later ran the Fife Nursing Home in London during the Second World War. In the midst of this darkness, there was a single piercing ray of light. On August 9, 1914, just 5 days after Britain had declared war, Alexandra gave birth to her first and only child, a son. He was named Alastair Arthur. His birth in the opening days of the greatest conflict in history was a beacon of hope in a world descending into madness. He was a symbol of continuity, of a future that had to be fought for. He was the heir to his mother's dukedom of Fife and, after his father and grandfather, to the dukedom of Connaught. He was a future duke, a great-grandson of one king-emperor and a great-nephew of the reigning one. His future seemed limitless, a bright promise in a time of profound despair. As the war dragged on, its political and social consequences deepened. One of the most significant for the royal family was the rising tide of anti-German sentiment in Britain. The German Kaiser was vilified in the press, and anything with a German connection became suspect. This posed a serious problem for the British monarchy, whose very name was German. The royal house was the House of Saxe-Coburg and Gotha, a name inherited from Queen Victoria's husband, Prince Albert. With German Gotha bombers flying over London, the name became a liability. In a brilliant act of public relations, King George V made a radical decision. On the 17th of July, 1917, he issued a royal proclamation, changing the family name. Henceforth, the British royal house would be known by a thoroughly English name, taken from the castle that had been a heart of the monarchy for centuries, the House of Windsor. At the same time, the king issued new letters patent that restricted the use of the titles Prince and Princess and the style Royal Highness to the children of the sovereign, the children of the sons of the sovereign, and the eldest living son of the eldest son of the Prince of Wales. This had a direct and immediate consequence for Alexandra's young son. As the son of a prince who was the son of a sovereign son, Alastair was in line for the title. However, as the rules were being tightened and the family streamlined, and given he was more distantly related to the direct line, he was not styled as a Prince of the United Kingdom. He was known by his father's senior courtesy title, the Earl of Macduff. It was a subtle legalistic distinction, one that made perfect sense in the context of creating a smaller, more modern monarchy. But for a young boy growing up among cousins who were princes and princesses, this distinction may have sowed the seeds of a future identity crisis, a sense of being royal, but not quite royal enough. While the House of Windsor was securing its identity at home, their Romanov relatives in Russia were facing total annihilation. The war had been a catastrophe for the Russian Empire. Military defeats, catastrophic food shortages, and gross political incompetence had led to widespread unrest. In March 1917, Tsar Nicholas II was forced to abdicate. He and his family, the Tsarina Alexandra, a granddaughter of Queen Victoria, and their 5 children, Olga, Tatiana, Maria, Anastasia, and Alexei, were placed under house arrest. The new provisional government in Russia was fragile, and King George V was put in an impossible position. The Tsar was his first cousin, a man he resembled so strongly they could have passed for twins. The Tsarina was his wife's cousin. Family loyalty and human decency dictated that he should offer them asylum in Britain. An initial offer was indeed extended. But the move was deeply unpopular at home. The Tsar was seen by many in Britain as a bloody autocrat, and with socialist sentiment on the rise, there were genuine fears that harboring the deposed monarch could spark a revolution. The king, a man who always placed the stability of his own throne above all else, was swayed by the advice of his government and his private secretary. Under immense political pressure, the offer of asylum was withdrawn. It was a pragmatic decision, born of fear, and it would prove to be a fatal one for the Romanovs. The consequences of this decision were horrific. The Bolsheviks, under Vladimir Lenin, seized power in Russia in the October Revolution and plunged the country into a brutal civil war. In the early hours of the 17th of July, 1918, exactly 1 year to the day after the founding of the House of Windsor, the Romanov family was woken in their cellar prison in the city of Ekaterinburg and brutally executed by a firing squad. The news of the massacre, when it eventually filtered out of Russia, sent a shock wave of absolute horror through every royal court in Europe. It was a brutal, definitive end to the old world of interconnected royalty. Monarchs were no longer just political rivals or dynastic chess pieces. They were class enemies, targets for extermination. For Alexandra, this was not a distant political event. These were her relatives. Her own beloved grandmother, the Dowager Queen Alexandra, was the sister of the murdered Tsar's mother, the Dowager Empress Marie Feodorovna, who had managed to escape the carnage. The grief within the family was personal, profound, and terrifying, a stark and unforgettable reminder of how fragile their own gilded world had become. Finally, after 4 long, brutal years that had consumed the lives of an entire generation, the war came to an end. At the 11th hour of the 11th day of the 11th month of 1918, the guns on the Western Front fell silent. A wave of delirious jubilation and profound, exhausted relief swept across Britain. But it was a victory that came at a staggering, almost incomprehensible cost. Nearly 1 million men from Britain and its empire were dead. The country was financially exhausted and psychologically scarred. The old certainties, the unshakable belief in progress, the deference to the established order, all had been shattered in the mud of Passchendaele and the Somme. Princess Alexandra was now 27 years old. The frivolous, glittering world of her debutante years was a distant memory, a lost civilization. She was a woman who had witnessed firsthand the devastating consequences of the war. She had seen the end of the great European empires and the murder of her own kin. She had found a sense of purpose not in a palace drawing room, but on a hospital ward. The war had been a crucible, burning away the frivolity of her youth and forging a quiet, steely strength. As Britain stepped into the uncertain, chaotic, and exhilarating new era of the 1920s, Alexandra stood as a representative of her class and generation, a survivor, forever marked by the cataclysm she had lived through, now facing the challenge of building a life in a world that had been irrevocably and violently remade. The end of the Great War did not bring a return to the world that had existed before. That world was gone forever, buried with the millions who had perished in its name. In its place rose a new era, a decade of profound and dizzying change, the Roaring Twenties. It was a time of jarring contradictions, of frantic, almost hysterical celebration, and deep-seated collective trauma, of glittering, credit-fueled prosperity and simmering social unrest. For a generation that had stared into the abyss, the post-war years were a desperate, determined embrace of life. The old, rigid social codes of the Edwardian era now seemed absurd and irrelevant. A new, modern culture was being born in the jazz, clubs, cinemas, and cocktail bars of London, Paris, and New York. Women in particular found a new freedom. The war had propelled them out of the domestic sphere and into factories, offices, and hospitals. In 1918, the Representation of the People Act granted the vote to women over the age of 30, a seismic shift in the political landscape. Fashion became a declaration of independence. The restrictive corsets and long skirts of the pre-war era were discarded in favor of shorter hemlines, dropped waists, and bobbed hair. The flapper emerged as the icon of the age, a young woman who smoked, drank, danced the Charleston, and embraced a freedom her mother could never have dreamed of. For Princess Alexandra and her husband Prince Arthur, however, the 1920s were not to be a decade of jazz-fueled hedonism. Their lives remained anchored by the old world principle of duty. In 1920, a significant new role was bestowed upon them. Prince Arthur was appointed Governor-General of the Union of South Africa, making him the king's personal representative in a dominion that was a crucial and often turbulent part of the British Empire. For Alexandra, this meant uprooting her life and her young son, Alastair, and taking on the demanding public role of vicereine. It was a position that required immense stamina, diplomacy, and a constant performance of regal graciousness. Life in South Africa was a world away from the misty hills of Scotland. They resided in government houses in Pretoria and Cape Town, grand colonial mansions run with military precision. Their lives were a relentless schedule of public engagements, opening parliaments, inspecting troops, hosting dignitaries, attending civic functions, and embarking on long, arduous tours across the vast and racially stratified country. For Alexandra, a woman who was naturally shy and cherished her privacy, this life lived entirely in the public glare must have been a considerable strain. Yet she performed her duties flawlessly. Photographs from the time show a woman of immense dignity and poise, elegantly dressed, always smiling, the perfect royal consort. She threw herself into charitable work, focusing on hospitals and child welfare, winning the respect and affection of many South Africans, at least within the white community. She projected an image of serene competence, but one can only imagine the personal effort it took to maintain that facade day after day. This formal colonial environment was the backdrop for the early childhood of her son, Alastair. Born in the first days of the war, he was now a young boy known formally as the Earl of Macduff. His upbringing was typical for a child of his class and time, but amplified by the unique circumstances of his position. He was raised almost exclusively by a retinue of nannies and tutors, seeing his parents mainly at designated times of the day. His life was governed by protocol and a level of formality that was stifling even by royal standards. He grew up in a world where his parents were public figures, distant and revered, and where his every action was observed. He was a lonely boy in a sun-drenched, gilded cage, surrounded by adults but with few, if any, playmates of his own age or station. The weight of expectation was on his small shoulders from the very beginning. He was the heir to 2 dukedoms, the future of 2 great family lines. It was a heavy burden for any child to bear, and it's in these formative, isolated years in South Africa that we can perhaps see the origins of the rudderless, insecure man he would become. When they returned to England in 1923, after Prince Arthur's term as Governor-General came to an end, they returned to a country that was in the full frenetic swing of the Jazz Age. They settled back into the familiar rhythm of royal life, a life that now seemed almost quaintly old-fashioned, compared to the fast-living set that revolved around the glamorous and ever-popular Prince of Wales. Alexandra and Arthur resumed their roster of official duties, but they were a quiet, steady, and slightly dull presence compared to the charismatic prince and his circle. They had a home in London, but their hearts were in the countryside, where they could enjoy a degree of privacy and family life. Alexandra could now focus more on the upbringing of her son, who was approaching adolescence. Alastair was, by all accounts, a bright and charming boy with his mother's fair hair and his father's handsome features. He was sent on the traditional path for a young man of his class, a preparatory school, followed by the hallowed halls of Eton College, and then on to the Royal Military College, Sandhurst. It was the production line for the British establishment, designed to instill the values of discipline, leadership, and service. On the surface, Alastair seemed to progress as expected. He was popular, intelligent, and excelled at languages. Yet, beneath the charming exterior, there were hints of a more troubled, rebellious, and perhaps self-destructive nature. He seemed to lack a core sense of purpose. He was constantly reminded of his unique heritage, yet his actual position was ambiguous. He was the Earl of Macduff, soon to be a duke, yet he was not a prince. He was a member of the royal family, but one on the periphery, without a defined role or a clear future. He was, in a sense, famous for who he was, not for anything he had done, a condition that can be profoundly corrosive to a young man's soul. While Alexandra navigated the challenges of raising her adolescent son, the world was once again sliding towards crisis. The Roaring Twenties came to a spectacular and devastating end with the Wall Street crash of 1929, plunging the world into the Great Depression. The era of Champagne and Charleston gave way to an age of soup kitchens and hunger marches. In Britain, mass unemployment scarred the industrial heartlands, breeding social unrest and political extremism. Against this bleak backdrop, a far more sinister threat was gathering force across the Channel. In 1933, Adolf Hitler came to power in Germany. His Nazi party, fueled by resentment and a militaristic, expansionist ideology that made another European war seem not just possible, but inevitable. The 1930s were lived under this gathering cloud of dread. For the royal family, the decade was also marked by a series of profound internal shocks. In 1936, the deeply respected King George V died, and the crown passed to his eldest son, who became King Edward VIII. The new king's affair with Wallis Simpson, a twice-divorced American woman, plunged the monarchy into its greatest crisis in modern history. The abdication in December 1936 was a family tragedy and a constitutional earthquake, a profound shock to a family that, like Alexandra's, prized duty above all else. But for Alexandra, these great historical events were about to be eclipsed by a tragedy that was far more intimate and immediate. Her husband, Prince Arthur, had been in failing health for some time. He was diagnosed with stomach cancer, a brutal and unforgiving disease. For months, Alexandra nursed him, drawing on the skills and the quiet fortitude she had learned on the hospital wards 20 years earlier. She watched as the strong, dependable soldier she had married was slowly consumed by the illness. On the 12th of September 1938, just as the crisis over Hitler's annexation of the Sudetenland was pushing Europe to the brink of war, Prince Arthur of Connaught died. He was only 55 years old. Alexandra was now a widow at just 47. The quiet, stable partnership that had been the anchor of her adult life for a quarter of a century was gone. She withdrew even further from public life, her world, which had once been so grand and expansive, shrinking to a single, anxious point of focus. Her son, Alastair, who was now 24 years old and had just lost his father. He was adrift, and she was alone, facing a future that felt more uncertain than ever, with the drums of war beating ever louder across the continent. The final, most devastating act of her life's tragedy was about to begin. Grief is a disorienting, lonely country, a landscape redrawn by loss. For Princess Alexandra, the death of her husband in the autumn of 1938 was not just the loss of a partner, it was the extinguishing of the central, steadying light of her life. Prince Arthur had been her companion in duty, a quiet, dependable presence who understood, without the need for words, the unique burdens and privileges of their existence. Without him, her public role, which had always been defined by her status as his wife, diminished. Her private world, which had always been small and carefully guarded, became more isolated than ever. She was still Her Royal Highness, still the Duchess of Fife, still a senior member of the royal family, but she was now defined by a new, unwelcome, and profoundly lonely title, widow. Her focus, which had always been divided between her husband, her son, and her duties, now converged with an intense, almost desperate energy onto one single point, Alastair. Now 24 years old, he had just lost his father at a critical juncture in his own young life. He was charming, handsome, and intelligent, but he was adrift in a way that deeply troubled her. He had completed his military training at Sandhurst and had been commissioned into his father's old regiment, the Royal Scots Greys. It was the expected path, the respectable choice, the fulfillment of a family tradition. Yet for Alastair, it seemed to be a role he was playing rather than a life he was choosing, a uniform he wore rather than an identity he inhabited. In the smart, fast-living society circles of late 1930s London, he was known as a good-time companion, fond of parties, fast cars, and, increasingly, heavy drinking. There was a restlessness about him, a melancholic dissatisfaction that the pursuit of pleasure could never quite seem to quell. The outbreak of the Second World War on September 3, 1939, should have been the clarifying event, the call to action that would give him the sense of purpose he so desperately seemed to lack. For his mother's generation, the First World War had been a defining crucible. For his, this new conflict was to be the same. The mood in Britain, however, was starkly different from the naive, flag-waving jingoism of 1914. There were no cheers, no cries of being home by Christmas. The generation that now had to fight, and the parents who had to send them to fight, knew the true face of modern warfare. They had seen the casualty lists, tended the wounded, and lived with the empty chairs at the dinner table. This time, there was only a quiet, grim resolve. For Alexandra, the news must have felt like a recurring nightmare. The world she had known, the fragile peace she had cherished for 2 decades, was once again being consumed by violence. The lessons of the Great War, it seemed, had not been learned. Drawing on the quiet fortitude that had become her hallmark, she once again threw herself into voluntary work. She was now in her late 40s, too old to return to full-time nursing on a hospital ward, but her experience and status made her an invaluable organizer and patron. She became a leading figure in local war-related charities in Angus, near her beloved Mar Lodge. She would have been deeply involved with the women's voluntary services, organizing the collection of scrap metal, knitting comforts for troops, and assisting with the welfare of evacuees. These were the quiet, unglamorous, but essential tasks that formed the backbone of the home front. Her work was, as always, undertaken without fanfare. It was a practical, personal contribution, a reflection of her deeply ingrained sense of duty, and perhaps a way to manage her own profound anxiety about the fate of her son. For Alastair, the war proved to be not a source of purpose, but of profound frustration. His military career did not unfold as he or his family might have hoped. Despite his Sandhurst training and his commission in a prestigious cavalry regiment, he was not destined for heroic deeds on the front line. For reasons that remain somewhat opaque, officially, he was deemed not physically robust enough for the rigors of active combat. He was sidelined. Whether this was due to genuine health concerns, or whether his superiors deemed him temperamentally unsuited for command, or whether it was simply a quiet decision by the establishment to protect a member of the royal family from harm, the effect on Alastair was the same. It was a source of deep, private humiliation. While his contemporaries and fellow officers were being sent to fight in France and later in North Africa, he was shuffled between a series of dreary staff posts in the UK, far from the action. His war was one of paperwork, logistics, and administration. It was safe, but it was also profoundly dull, and for a young man from a long line of distinguished soldiers, deeply unfulfilling. His sense of uselessness festered, exacerbating the feelings of inadequacy that had long plagued him. He was a soldier who wasn't allowed to fight, a royal with no real role. The situation only fueled his disillusionment and his reliance on alcohol as an escape. Then, in January 1942, an event occurred that should have been a moment of great personal significance. His paternal grandfather, the old Prince Arthur, Duke of Connaught, the last surviving son of Queen Victoria and a living embodiment of the Victorian era, died at the grand age of 91. Alastair's father, Prince Arthur, had predeceased the old duke, which meant that Alastair was now the direct heir. And so, at the age of 27, Alastair inherited the title. He was no longer the Earl of Macduff. He was now His Grace Alastair, the second Duke of Connaught and Strathearn and Earl of Sussex. It was one of the grandest titles in the kingdom, a royal dukedom steeped in history. But the inheritance was a hollow one. The title came with no new responsibilities, no great estates to manage. The family seat of Bagshot Park reverted to the crown, no automatic seat in the House of Lords, and no real power or influence. It was just another grand costume to wear, another heavy cloak of expectation to be draped over his increasingly weary shoulders. If anything, the grandness of the title only served to highlight the emptiness of his role. It likely made him feel even more of a fraud, a duke in name only. The establishment, and certainly his concerned family, realized that something had to be done with this troubled, under-occupied young duke. A plan was hatched, a classic establishment solution for a difficult problem. A new post was found for him, one that would take him far from the temptations of the London social scene, and it was hoped impose some much-needed structure and discipline on his life. He was to be sent to Canada to serve as an aide-de-camp to the then Governor-General, the Earl of Athlone. On the surface, it was a prestigious and highly suitable appointment. The Governor-General was not just any colonial official. He was Major General Alexander Cambridge, 1st Earl of Athlone, the younger brother of Queen Mary, and thus Alastair's great-uncle by marriage. His wife, the Vicereine, was Princess Alice of Albany, a granddaughter of Queen Victoria, and therefore Alastair's first cousin once removed. He would be living at Rideau Hall in Ottawa, the official residence, surrounded by family. It was presented as a fresh start, a safe haven, a chance for him to perform a useful role in the Commonwealth war effort. For Alexandra, the news must have been met with a complex mixture of hope and trepidation. Hope that the responsibility and the change of scenery would be the making of her son, but a deep, gnawing anxiety at the thought of him being so far away, across a submarine-infested ocean in the midst of a world at war. Alastair arrived in Ottawa in late 1942. The plan, so logical on paper, quickly began to unravel. Far from being a fresh start, the Canadian posting felt to him like a gilded exile. Rideau Hall was a grand and imposing residence, but the reality of his work was profoundly mundane. As an aide-de-camp, he was little more than a glorified personal assistant. His days filled with ceremonial duties he found tedious, responding to correspondence and generally being at the beck and call of the Governor-General. He found the work not just boring, but demeaning. His sense of isolation deepened. He was in a foreign country, separated from the few friends he had in London. The notoriously harsh Canadian winter began to set in, plunging the city into months of deep snow and bitter cold, a bleak physical manifestation of his internal state. His relationship with his relatives, the Athlones, was strained. Princess Alice, in particular, was a formidable, no-nonsense Victorian matriarch. Seeing Alastair's unhappiness and his weakness for drink, she attempted to take him in hand, to impose a strict discipline upon him. But he was not a boy to be chided. He was a duke, a man of 28, and he bristled under her well-intentioned but authoritarian attempts to manage him. He felt patronized, trapped, and utterly alone. He was a duke in a gilded cage, and he began to rattle the bars with a desperate, self-destructive energy. His drinking, which had been a concern in London, reportedly spiraled out of control in the lonely, formal atmosphere of Rideau Hall. There were stories of erratic behavior, of him disappearing for days at a time on alcoholic binges, causing immense worry and embarrassment to the Governor General's household. Beneath the surface, an even more dangerous secret may have been festering. The candid and often scandalous diaries of the London society figure Sir Henry Chips Channon contain several entries that strongly hint at Alastair being bisexual. In an era when homosexuality was a criminal offense, a source of profound social shame, and a constant threat of blackmail, this would have been an almost unbearable secret for a man in his position to carry. The immense pressure of living a double life, of concealing his true nature from his family and the world, combined with the weight of his other insecurities, could well have been the breaking point. He was a young man wrestling with demons he could not name, burdened by a heritage he had not asked for, and a future he could not see. The final act began on the night of April 25th, 1943. It was a Saturday. Alastair had been out for the evening attending a party. By all accounts, he had been drinking heavily. He returned to his rooms at Rideau Hall late in the evening, stumbling, heavily intoxicated. The next morning, a member of staff, concerned by his failure to appear, entered his room. The fire in the hearth had burned out. The room was deathly cold, and on the floor, beneath a wide open window that looked out onto the frozen grounds of the residence, lay the lifeless body of the second Duke of Connaught. He had stumbled back into his gilded cage for the last time, and in the cold, silent darkness of a single Canadian night, his troubled life had come to its quiet, inexplicable end. The discovery, on that cold Sunday morning of April 26, 1943, sent an immediate and seismic shockwave through the cloistered world of Rideau Hall. The household of a Governor General is run with the meticulous precision of a military operation and the hushed formality of a royal court. The sudden, unnatural death of a guest, and not just any guest, but a duke, a member of the king's own family, was a crisis of the highest order. The immediate priority was not truth, but control. Control of the scene, control of the staff, and above all, control of the narrative. In the midst of a global war, with the nation's morale a precious and fragile commodity, a royal scandal was an unthinkable catastrophe. The curtain of silence, so readily available to the establishment, descended instantly. The first calls were not to the local Ottawa police, but to the highest echelons of the Royal Canadian Mounted Police, and to the King's representative, the Earl of Athlone himself. The scene in Alastair's room was examined, but this was no ordinary investigation. It was a damage limitation exercise. The key facts were established quickly. The body was on the floor, the window was open, the room was freezing, and the Duke was clearly deceased. A physician was summoned, who would have confirmed the absence of any obvious signs of foul play. No wounds, no evidence of a struggle. The conclusion of hypothermia, exacerbated by extreme intoxication, would have presented itself as a tidy, convenient, and, most importantly, non-scandalous explanation. It was a verdict as neat as a folded flag. The decision to forego a formal coroner's inquest was the most telling move of all. For the death of an ordinary citizen under such unusual circumstances, an inquest would have been mandatory. But Alastair was not an ordinary citizen. A public inquiry would have meant witnesses being called, sworn testimony being given. It would have meant probing, uncomfortable questions about the Duke's state of mind, his well-known drinking habits, his activities on the night of his death. It would have meant the press, both Canadian and international, descending on the story, hungry for salacious details. For the Crown and for the war effort, this was a risk that could not be taken. And so, with the full authority of the Governor General, and one must assume the tacit approval of London. The matter was handled internally. The official cause of death was registered, the book was closed. It was a master class in institutional crisis management. While this quiet, efficient machinery was whirring into action in Ottawa, an ocean away in London, Princess Alexandra was entirely unaware that her world had just been shattered. The news would have reached her in the way such news always reaches royalty, through a cold, formal, and utterly impersonal channel. A telegram would have been dispatched from the Governor-General's office to the appropriate channels in Whitehall, and from there, a senior court official would have been tasked with informing her. There would have been no gentle, compassionate breaking of the news, no friend or family member to hold her hand. Just a liveried courtier, a crisp envelope, and a few stark typewritten words confirming the unbelievable. Her son Alastair was dead. The impact of that message on a woman who had already lost her father and her husband is almost impossible to comprehend. It was a grief that had no geography. Her son had died alone, thousands of miles away. In an era of wartime travel restrictions, there was no question of her rushing to his side, of seeing him one last time, of taking charge of the arrangements. She was utterly powerless, a mother trapped by distance, forced to rely on the filtered second-hand information that the official channels chose to share with her. She had to accept the story she was given, a story that explained everything and yet explained nothing at all. The story of an accident. But was it that simple? Was it merely a case of drunken carelessness with a tragic outcome? This is the most likely, the most plausible, and the most charitable explanation. It is the story that history has largely accepted. Alastair was known to drink to excess. Alcohol impairs judgment, slows down the body's responses, and critically lowers the core body temperature, making one dangerously susceptible to cold. It is entirely plausible that in a drunken stupor he opened the window for air, stumbled, hit his head, and lost consciousness on the floor. Or perhaps he simply passed out, oblivious to the freezing air pouring into the room. In this scenario, his death was a tragic but fundamentally simple accident. It is the explanation that requires the fewest assumptions, the one that aligns with the known facts of his behavior. And yet the neatness of it is precisely what makes it so unsettling. It feels incomplete, a narrative with crucial pages torn out. The questions linger, whispering from the past. Why was the window wide open in the dead of a Canadian winter? Was this a habit of his? It seems unlikely. And how could a duke, a member of the royal family, living in the official residence of the Governor-General, be left so completely alone that he could freeze to death over the course of several hours? The protocol in such a household would have been strict. Surely a valet or an aide would have been tasked with checking on him, with ensuring he was safely in bed. The failure to do so suggests a level of negligence that is difficult to believe, unless the staff had been given implicit instructions to leave him be, to not interfere with his drunken episodes, or unless, by the time he returned to his room, the household was long asleep, and his final fatal crisis unfolded in complete and utter silence. This leads to the second, far more disturbing possibility, that Alastair's death was not an accident at all, but an act of suicide. This is a theory that cannot be proven, but it is one that cannot be entirely dismissed either. The evidence is circumstantial, but it is compelling. Consider the state of his life. Here was a young man who, despite his grand titles, felt like a failure. He was a soldier in wartime who had been denied the chance to prove his courage in battle. He was a duke with no role, no purpose, and no power. He was an exile, unhappy and isolated in a foreign country. He was, according to some sources, grappling with a secret sexuality that could have led to his total ruin and disgrace. His life was a litany of frustrations and disappointments, a heavy costume he was growing tired of wearing. In this context, his death takes on a different light. The open window ceases to be a random detail and becomes a potential instrument. Was the fall that knocked him unconscious intentional? Or more chillingly, was it a more passive act? Perhaps in a state of drunken despair, he opened the window to the freezing night air, lay down on the floor, and simply gave up, letting the cold do its work. It would have been a quiet, lonely, and ambiguous end, one that could easily be disguised as an accident. For a man trapped in a life he could not escape, it might have seemed like the only way out. The third possibility, that of a cover-up, is not necessarily a contradiction of the first two. It is almost a certainty. The establishment, the Athlones, the Canadian government, and Buckingham Palace had a profound and overwhelming interest in ensuring that the official story was one of accidental death. Suicide was, in the 1940s, not just a tragedy. It was a sin, a crime, and a source of profound social shame. The suicide of a royal duke, a great-grandson of Queen Victoria, during the darkest days of the war would have been a catastrophic blow to the prestige of the monarchy and to national morale. It would have been seen as a sign of weakness, of degeneracy running through the very veins of the ruling class. An accident, however tragic, is clean. It carries no shame. Suicide is messy. It invites questions. It implies a sickness of the mind or a moral failing. The decision to seal the records, to bypass an inquest, and to present a united, unwavering front was almost certainly a conscious one. The goal was not to uncover the nuanced, painful truth of a troubled young man's death, but to protect the institution he represented. The truth, whatever it was a casualty of the same principle that had governed Alexandra's entire life: duty. The duty to the crown in this case meant a duty to silence. The funeral arrangements were a final, poignant reflection of Alexandra's tragic isolation. Due to the immense dangers of wartime transatlantic travel, it was deemed impossible for her to journey to Canada. She could not attend her own son's funeral. On April the 29th, 1943, a quiet military funeral followed, but his remains were ultimately interred at St. Ninian's Chapel, Marlodge in Scotland. With Alastair's death, an entire line of the British royal family was extinguished. He died unmarried and childless. The royal dukedom of Connaught and Strathearn, created for Queen Victoria's third son, now became extinct. The dukedom of Fife, which he had been destined to inherit from his mother, would now pass upon her death to her nephew, James Carnegie, the son of her sister Maud. Everything that Alastair had been born to be, everything he had been raised to inherit, vanished in that one night. For Princess Alexandra, the aftermath was a new, permanent state of being. The war still raged, and her duties continued. She would have appeared in public, a serene, dignified figure in black, her face a mask of regal composure. But her private world had been hollowed out. She had lost the three central men in her life: her father to the sea, her husband to disease, and now her son to a tragedy, shrouded in silence. She was the last of her immediate line, a solitary figure left to navigate the final decades of her life alone. The great storms had passed, but they had taken everything from her. All that remained was the quiet, the grief, and the long, slow duty of survival. The end of the Second World War, when it finally came in 1945, was met in Britain not with the delirious flag-waving jubilation that had marked the armistice of 1918, but with a profound, bone-deep exhaustion. The country had been battered, bombed, and bled dry. It was victorious, but it was also bankrupt and weary. For 6 years, The nation had been united in a singular existential struggle for survival. Now, in the sudden, quiet aftermath, came the daunting task of rebuilding a shattered world and facing a future that was profoundly uncertain. In the general election of July 1945, the British people, in a surprising landslide, voted out their revered wartime leader, Winston Churchill, and ushered in a radical Labour government under Clement Attlee. It was a clear signal that the old world, the world of empire, deference, and aristocracy that Alexandra had been born into, was not to be rebuilt. A new, more egalitarian Britain was to be forged from the ashes, with a national health service, a welfare state, and the slow, inexorable dismantling of the very empire her grandfather had so proudly embodied. For Princess Alexandra, this new dawn felt like a foreign country. The public celebrations that filled the streets of London, the bunting, the dancing, the bonfires, were for others. For her, there was no personal victory, only a vast and hollow emptiness. The end of the war did not bring her son home. It only confirmed the permanence of his absence. The peace the world celebrated was, for her, a landscape of profound and unending grief. She was now 54 years old, a widow who had outlived her only child. The great dramas of her life were now complete. The climactic tragedies had all been enacted. All that was left was the long, quiet epilogue. In the years that followed, she retreated almost completely from the public eye. The shy princess who had always preferred the solitude of the Scottish Highlands to the relentless glare of London court life now had a tragic and unassailable reason to embrace her privacy. Her life became a quiet, predictable rhythm, divided between her formal London residence and the place that held the shattered pieces of her heart, Mar Lodge. In Scotland, amidst the ancient, enduring beauty of the Cairngorms, she could find a measure of solace. The wild, dramatic landscape was a connection to her father, to her own carefree childhood, to a time before the storms had come. She was a skilled angler and found a meditative peace in the quiet concentration of fishing for salmon on the River Dee. She oversaw the running of the vast Fife estates, a duty she had inherited as a young woman, and which now gave her a welcome practical focus, a structure for her empty days. She did not, however, abandon her duties entirely. Her commitment to service, forged in the crucible of the First World War, remained a core part of her identity. She continued her patronage of numerous charities, with a particular focus on health care. She was the devoted and active president of the Royal Alexandra Hospital for Children in Brighton, a role she took with the utmost seriousness. Her hospital visits were not the fleeting formal affairs of some royals. She would spend hours on the wards, speaking to the nurses, comforting the sick children and their anxious parents. In the suffering of others, perhaps, she found a reflection of her own, and in offering comfort, she may have found a small measure of her own. These duties were her anchor, a quiet, continuing thread of purpose in a life that had been stripped of its personal meaning. She was the dutiful princess, playing her part to the very end. She remained, of course, a senior member of the royal family, a great-granddaughter of Queen Victoria, and she would appear at the great state occasions that marked the post-war reign of her cousin, King George VI, and later her cousin once removed, Queen Elizabeth II. These appearances must have been moments of profound and poignant complexity for her. In 1947, she attended the wedding of Princess Elizabeth to Philip Mountbatten at Westminster Abbey. As she sat in the abbey, surrounded by the pageantry and optimism of a new royal generation, she would have seen not just her young cousin embarking on a life of love and duty, but the ghost of her own wedding 34 years earlier. She would have felt the ghost of her husband Arthur by her side, and the ghost of her son Alastair, the future that was never to be. For her, the celebration of a royal marriage, an event centered on the promise of continuity and succession, would have been an almost unbearably sharp reminder of her own broken line. 5 years later, in 1952, the king died, and she attended the funeral of the cousin who had been a quiet, steady presence for most of her life. And in June 1953, she took her place in Westminster Abbey, once again for the magnificent televised coronation of Queen Elizabeth II. It was a spectacle that enchanted the world, a symbol of a new Elizabethan age, a moment of immense national pride and hope for the future. For Alexandra, now in her early 60s, it was the culmination of a life lived in the shadow of the throne. She was a living link to the past, one of the few people in the Abbey that day who could remember the reign of Queen Victoria. She watched the solemn ancient rituals of the anointing and crowning, rituals that underscored the sacred unbroken line of succession. And as she watched the young queen, a woman who now bore the immense weight of the crown, she must have reflected on the very different, but no less heavy, burden she herself had been forced to carry, the burden of surviving. As the years passed, the immense strain of her life's tragedies began to take a physical toll. Her health, which had never been particularly robust, began to fail. She was afflicted with severe rheumatoid arthritis, a painful and debilitating condition that made movement increasingly difficult. The disease is often exacerbated by stress and trauma, and it is not hard to imagine that the immense, unspoken grief she had carried for so long was now manifesting itself in her own body. Her world grew smaller still, her public appearances rarer. She became a more reclusive figure, a solitary woman living with her memories and her pain. She was the last of her line. Her beloved younger sister, Maud, who had married a Scottish nobleman and lived the quiet country life Alexandra herself had craved, had died during the war in December 1945 from acute bronchitis. Alexandra had outlived them all: her father, her mother, her sister, her husband, and her son. She was a monument to a vanished era, a lonely survivor of a family that had been cruelly whittled away by fate. Her final illness was mercifully brief. In February 1959, at her home in London, Princess Alexandra, Her Royal Highness Princess Arthur of Connaught, 2nd Duchess of Fife, died peacefully in her sleep. She was 67 years old. Her death was not a major headline. In a world now captivated by rock and roll, the Cold War, and the space race, the passing of a quiet, elderly princess from a bygone era was a minor note. Her funeral was a private affair, attended by the Queen and other members of the royal family. She was laid to rest not in the grand royal vault at Windsor, but in the quiet solitude of St. Ninian's Chapel on her private estate at Mar Lodge, alongside her husband and her parents, her family united at last in the Scottish earth she had loved so deeply. With her death, the dukedom of Fife passed to her nephew, and one of the last personal links to the glittering, confident, and ultimately doomed court of King Edward VII was broken forever. She had lived a life of almost perfect paradox. Born to immense privilege, she endured immense suffering. Destined for a life in the public eye, she craved only privacy. She was a princess who found her truest calling not on a throne, but in a hospital ward. She was a mother whose only child was taken from her in a tragedy that was never fully explained. Her life began with all the certainty of the Victorian age and ended in the quiet aftermath of a world remade by war and loss. What then is the legacy of such a life? What is the meaning of a story marked by such quiet dignity and such profound sorrow? Princess Alexandra's life began as a footnote in the epic saga of the House of Windsor, and ended as a poignant whisper against the roar of a new modern age. Her story is not a grand, sweeping epic of power and politics. It is a quiet, deliberate counter-narrative to the public spectacle of 20th century royalty. Born into a world of gilded certainty, she was a princess who chose duty, a duchess who chose service, and ultimately, a mother defined by the most profound and unending grief imaginable. In an age of revolution, war, and relentless change, she did not rebel or abdicate. She endured. She chose a life of quiet, unassuming service, upholding the values of duty and sacrifice she had been raised with, even as the world that had created those values crumbled into dust around her. It was a choice that required a gentle but unshakable strength, a quiet resilience forged in the fires of repeated tragedy. Her life was a testament to the idea that fulfillment can be found not in the grand gesture, but in the steady daily commitment to others. But her story is also a haunting and deeply human reflection on the immense personal cost of that duty. It serves as a powerful reminder that behind the palace walls, behind the titles and the tiaras, are hearts that can be broken, just as ours are. Alexandra's life was a masterclass in regal composure, but it was a composure that masked a pain few of us will ever have to bear. She survived the great storms of history, 2 world wars, the fall of empires, the murder of her kin, but she was denied the lasting peace that should have followed. Hers is not simply a story of what was, but also a haunting reflection on what might have been for her son Alastair, a young man lost to the pressures of his position and his own private demons. What might have been for her own family line, a future that was stolen from her in a single cold Canadian night. It is the quiet, enduringly human story of a duchess who possessed all the material wealth the world could offer, but who lost the one thing that truly mattered. And in that silence, in the unanswered questions that will forever surround her son's death, and in the quiet, uncomplaining dignity with which she bore her sorrow for the rest of her days, lies her true and lasting legacy. It is not a legacy of power or of fame, but something far more resonant, a powerful, poignant reminder of the fragile beauty, the profound suffering, and the quiet, unbreakable courage of a human heart.